In the depths of night, Sarah Mitchell jolted awake to an unmistakable sound, the gentle creak of her kitchen window. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she lay frozen in her bed, ears straining in the darkness. The baby monitor beside her bed showed her 6-month-old son, Tommy, sleeping peacefully in his crib. But something was wrong. Living alone with an infant had sharpened her instincts, and tonight they were screaming. The sound came again, a soft scraping followed by the whisper of movement downstairs. Sarah's trembling fingers found her phone, ready to call the police, but curiosity and fear warred within her. The security system hadn't triggered, and there was something almost deliberate about the sounds. Rising from her bed, Sarah crept to her bedroom door, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. The familiar layout of her modest 2-story home felt alien in the darkness, every shadow a potential threat. As she reached the top of the stairs, she heard it, a sound that made her blood run cold, the distinct clink of plates in her kitchen. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. A burglar. But why would they be handling dishes? A homeless person searching for food? The explanations felt hollow, insufficient. Tommy's monitor showed him still sleeping soundly, giving her the courage to investigate. Step by step, she descended the stairs, each creak beneath her feet sounding like thunder in the silent house. The kitchen light was off, but the full moon cast an ethereal glow through the windows, creating sharp shadows that danced across the walls. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, Sarah grabbed the heavy flashlight she kept by the entrance, a makeshift weapon if needed. The kitchen doorway loomed before her, and Sarah held her breath, counting to 3 before whirling around the corner. Flashlight raised. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a scene that made her question her sanity. There, perched on her kitchen counter with impossible grace, was a chimpanzee. Not a person, not a burglar, but a full-grown chimpanzee. The creature froze, caught in the act of arranging fruit and bread on one of her plates. Their eyes met, and Sarah felt the world tilt on its axis. The chimp didn't flee. Instead, it held her gaze with an intelligence that sent shivers down her spine. In its hands was a banana, partially peeled and arranged on the plate before it was an assortment of foods from her kitchen, apples sliced with surprising precision, chunks of bread, and even a handful of Tommy's baby cookies. Sarah's mind struggled to process what she was seeing. The chimp's presence was impossible. They lived in a suburban area outside Boston, not anywhere near where a chimpanzee should be. Yet here it was, preparing what looked like a careful arrangement of food in her kitchen at 2 in the morning. As she stood frozen in disbelief, the chimp slowly resumed its task, keeping its eyes on her while placing the banana on the plate. Its movements were deliberate, almost gentle, showing none of the aggression she'd expect from a wild animal cornered in a strange place. Then came the sound that changed everything. Tommy's cry through the baby monitor. The chimp's head snapped toward the sound, and its expression shifted to something Sarah could only describe as concern. Before she could move or speak, the creature grabbed the plate and, with incredible agility, leapt from the counter toward the window. Sarah lunged forward, her voice finally finding its way out of her throat. "Wait!" The word echoed in the kitchen, but the chimp was already through the window, disappearing into the night with the plate of food. Racing to the window, Sarah caught a glimpse of a dark shape moving across her backyard, heading toward the dense woods that bordered her property. The moonlight caught the plate in its hands, food still perfectly balanced despite its rapid movement. Upstairs, Tommy's cries grew more insistent. Sarah stood rooted to the spot, her mind reeling from what she'd witnessed. As she turned to go, comfort her son, her eye caught something that made her breath catch. Tiny handprints on the counter, not from human hands, but perfectly formed chimp prints in the dust. This was no hallucination. Moving through her kitchen in a daze, Sarah noticed other details she'd missed in the initial shock. The fruit had been cut with one of her knives, which now lay washed and returned to its proper place. The bread bag was neatly closed with its twist tie. Even the counter had been wiped clean, except for those telling handprints. As she prepared to head upstairs to Tommy, a thought struck her with the force of a physical blow. This didn't feel like a random event. The chimp's actions were too purposeful, too organized. and something about the way it had reacted to Tommy's cry. The following nights brought more questions than answers. Sarah barely slept, spending hours by her window, watching and waiting. She hadn't called the police. How could she explain a domesticated-seeming chimpanzee arranging midnight snacks in her kitchen? They'd think she was having a mental breakdown from single motherhood. Instead, she began documenting everything. Her kitchen became a research station of sorts. Each morning, she photographed the evidence, carefully arranged plates of food, precise cuts in fruit, and occasionally, small fingerprints left behind. The chimpanzee returned like clockwork, always between 2 AX and 2:30 a.m., always bringing food to what she now realized was meant for Tommy. 1 week after the first encounter, Sarah noticed something that made her question everything she thought she knew. The baby food jars in her cabinet had been reorganized, not randomly but by ingredient and age appropriateness. The chimp wasn't just bringing food, it understood what Tommy needed. "This is impossible," Sarah whispered to herself, staring at the perfectly aligned jars. Her background as a pediatric nurse made the situation even more baffling. The chimp showed an understanding of infant nutrition that went beyond simple instinct. That night, she decided to take a risk. Instead of hiding or pretending to sleep, she waited in the kitchen. The house was silent except for the gentle hum of the baby monitor and the distant sound of crickets. At exactly 2:15 a.m., she heard the familiar sound of the window opening. The chimp appeared, silhouetted against the moonlight. This time, Sarah could see it clearly. A female, smaller than she'd initially thought, with gentle eyes that held an almost human sadness. In her hands was not just food, but one of Tommy's bottles, cleaned and ready for use. "Hello?" Sarah said softly, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I know you've been helping us." The chimp stopped, tilting her head. There was no fear in her posture, only cautious curiosity. She placed the bottle on the counter with deliberate care, then reached into what Sarah now saw was a worn canvas bag slung across her body. What emerged next made Sarah's heart skip a beat. It was a photograph, crumpled and weathered, but still clear enough to make out the image. A research facility, and in it, a younger version of this same chimp, cradling a human infant while a woman in a lab coat looked on. Sarah's hands trembled as she took the offered photo. You were part of a research program." The chimp's eyes seemed to brighten with recognition at the words. She pointed to the infant in the photo, then made a rocking motion with her arms. The pieces began falling into place. Sarah had read about primate research facilities studying maternal behavior, but this was different. This chimp hadn't just been studied, she'd been a caregiver. As if to confirm her thoughts, the chimp reached out slowly and touched Tommy's bottle, then pointed upstairs toward his room. Her gestures were clear. She wanted to help, to care for Tommy. But why? The answer came in a rush of memory. 3 months ago, when Sarah had first moved to this house, there had been news reports about a local research facility shutting down unexpectedly. The stories mentioned animals being relocated, but there had been rumors of some escaping during the chaos. "You've been watching us since we moved in, haven't you?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. The chimp had probably seen her struggling, a single mother working long shifts at the hospital, trying to balance everything alone. The chimp's response was unexpected. She pulled out a small, worn notebook from her bag. The pages were filled with what looked like feeding schedules, developmental milestones, and basic care instructions, all written in a researcher's hand. This wasn't just any experiment. This chimp had been trained in infant care. Sarah sank into a kitchen chair, overwhelmed by the implications. The chimp, she needed a name, Sarah thought absently, had been watching over them like a guardian angel, using her training to help care for Tommy when she saw a mother in need. But as touching as this revelation was, it also filled Sarah with dread. If the chimp had escaped from a research facility, people would be looking for her. And if they found her here, what would happen to this extraordinary creature who had chosen to use her training to help a struggling mother and her baby? The sound of Tommy stirring through the monitor broke the moment. The chimp's head snapped up, her expression changing to one of concern. Without hesitation, she picked up the bottle she'd brought and held it out to Sarah insistently. "He's not due for a feeding for another hour," Sarah said automatically, then stopped, amazed at how quickly she'd fallen into treating the chimp like a fellow caregiver. But the chimp shook her head, pointing at the bottle, then at her own ear, making a motion like crying. Sure enough, within seconds, Tommy's full-throated wail filled the house. The chimp had anticipated his hunger before he even woke up. Sarah stared at her in amazement, accepting the bottle with shaking hands. "You really do know what you're doing, don't you?" The chimp's eyes crinkled in what could only be described as a smile, but there was something else there too, a sadness, a longing that made Sarah's heart ache. What had happened at that research facility? And more importantly, what would happen if anyone discovered this extraordinary midnight visitor? The discovery of the chimp's identity, whom Sarah had started calling Grace, led her down a rabbit hole of research. Late at night, after Tommy was asleep and Grace had made her nightly visit, Sarah scoured the internet for information about the closed research facility. The Western Massachusetts Primate Research Center had operated for over 2 decades before its sudden closure. Most articles focused on standard behavioral studies, but buried in old academic journals, Sarah found something extraordinary, a classified project called Operation Nurture. Her hands trembled as she read the abstract, "Study on Enhanced Primate Maternal Capabilities through Immersive Human-Infant Care Training." The dates matched perfectly with the photograph Grace had shown her, but it was a different image that made her blood run cold. A group photo of the research team, and there, in the back row, was a face she recognized all too well. David Mitchell, her ex-husband, Tommy's father. Sarah sat back in her chair, feeling as if all the air had been sucked from the room. David had told her he was a pharmaceutical researcher. He'd never mentioned working with primates, let alone being part of a revolutionary behavioral study. When he'd abandoned them 3 months into her pregnancy, he'd said the pressure of impending fatherhood was too much. Now she wondered if there had been more to his departure. A soft tap at the window interrupted her thoughts. Grace was there, but something was different. The chimp's movements were agitated, her eyes darting nervously to the shadows behind her. Sarah rushed to let her in, and Grace immediately pressed a crumpled piece of paper into her hands. It was a newspaper clipping, dated just 2 days ago. Private security firm hired to locate missing research assets. The article mentioned the same facility, describing the search for valuable research subjects that had escaped during the shutdown. "They're looking for you, aren't they?" Sarah whispered. Grace's response was to pull out her worn notebook again, frantically flipping to a page Sarah hadn't seen before. There, in David's distinctive handwriting, was a note that changed everything. "Subject G7 Grace has exceeded all expectations. Maternal bonding capabilities far beyond projected parameters. Warning, termination of project may result in severe emotional trauma. Recommendation, permanent placement in controlled environment for continued observation." Below this clinical assessment was a hastily scrawled addition. "They're going to destroy everything. Grace knows too much, God forgive me." Sarah's mind raced. David hadn't just abandoned them, he'd been involved in something far more complex. And Grace wasn't just a trained caregiver. She was evidence of something that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. A distant sound made Grace freeze. Her eyes locked with Sarah's, conveying an urgency that transcended species. She gestured to Tommy's room, then to herself, making a protective motion. The message was clear. She wasn't just helping with Tommy out of kindness or training, she was protecting him. "Grace," Sarah said slowly, "did you know David? Did you know he was Tommy's father?" The chimp's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. She pulled out the old photograph again, but this time turned it over. On the back was another note in David's writing, "Grace and subject T23, final day of bonding trials." Sarah's hands shook as she realized what she was seeing. The baby in the photograph, the one Grace had been cradling so carefully, had a small birthmark on its neck, identical to the one Tommy had. "Oh my God," Sarah breathed. Tommy was part of the project before he was even born. "David wasn't just researching maternal behavior, he was studying you with my baby." Grace's eyes filled with what looked like tears. She reached into her bag one last time and withdrew something that made Sarah's heart stop, a small USB drive, wrapped carefully in a protective cloth. Before Sarah could react, a bright light swept across the kitchen window. Grace immediately dropped into a defensive crouch, her body language shifting from gentle caregiver to protective guardian. Through the glass, Sarah could see the beam of a flashlight moving methodically across her backyard. They were no longer alone. Grace moved with decisive speed, pressing the USB drive into Sarah's hands and making an urgent shooing motion toward the stairs. But Sarah hesitated, unwilling to leave this extraordinary creature to face whatever was coming alone. The sound of boots on gravel drifted through the window. Grace's eyes met Sarah's one last time, and in them was a depth of emotion that defied any notion of the divide between human and animal. She pointed to the USB drive, then to Tommy's room, and finally placed her hand over her heart. Sarah understood. Grace wasn't just a research subject who had escaped. She was a protector who had chosen her mission, and now she was entrusting Sarah with whatever secrets that drive contained. Secrets that might explain everything about David's disappearance, the project's sudden shutdown, and why a highly trained chimpanzee had appointed herself guardian to a single mother and her baby. Sarah's hands trembled as she connected the USB drive to her laptop, Tommy sleeping peacefully in his crib beside her. The sound of voices and footsteps continued outside, but upstairs they were temporarily safe. The screen flickered to life, revealing dozens of video files and documents. The first video made her gasp. It showed Grace in a sterile laboratory environment, but not as a test subject. The chimp was methodically preparing baby formula, checking its temperature, and recording data on a clipboard with remarkable precision. But it was the date stamp that caught Sarah's attention, exactly 1 year ago when she was 3 months pregnant. David's voice came through the speakers. Day 457 of behavioral modification. Subject G7 continues to demonstrate extraordinary cognitive development. Her ability to anticipate infant needs now exceeds that of most human caregivers. The next file was even more revealing. Grace was sitting in what looked like a nursery, cradling a baby, Tommy, while David and other researchers observed. Her movements were gentle, precise, and unmistakably loving. The scientists discussed something called Project Guardian, but David's voice carried an edge of concern. "We've gone too far," he was saying to someone off camera. "The emotional bond is too strong. She's not just caring for them anymore. She's protecting them." The implications. The video cut off abruptly. Sarah clicked through more files, her heart racing as the full picture began to emerge. Project Guardian wasn't just about studying maternal behavior. It was about creating the perfect caregiver, one that would bond completely with its charge and protect it at any cost. A document labeled Final Report caught her eye. As she read, her blood ran cold. Subject G7 has developed unprecedented emotional intelligence and protective instincts. However, the strength of these bonds presents an unforeseen risk. When separated from infant subjects, she demonstrates extreme distress and will attempt to locate and resume caregiving duties. Most concerning is her ability to track and identify specific infants even after prolonged separation. Recommendation: immediate termination of project and... The rest was corrupted. But Sarah could guess what it said. They had created something they couldn't control, a being with the intelligence to care for human infants and the instinct to protect them at any cost. A sudden crash from downstairs jolted her from the screen. Heavy footsteps echoed through the house, accompanied by urgent whispers. Sarah quickly ejected the drive and clutched Tommy to her chest, her mind racing. They had to get out. But as she reached for her phone to call for help, a new video file caught her eye, one labeled simply, David's Confession. With shaking hands, she pressed play. David's face filled the screen, looking haunted and afraid. "Sarah, if you're watching this, it means Grace found you. I'm so sorry for everything. When we discovered her abilities, her capacity for love and protection, we thought we were making breakthrough in understanding primate intelligence, but we created something more, a guardian who could love and protect better than any human." He ran his hands through his hair, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "They want to destroy all evidence of the project, including Grace. But she's not just a test subject. She's family. She helped care for Tommy before he was born, was there for every ultrasound, every heartbeat. Her bond with him is real. I couldn't let them hurt her, so I helped her escape. If you're seeing this, it means she found her way back to Tommy, just like I knew she would. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as the truth hit her. David hadn't abandoned them. He'd sacrificed everything to protect both Tommy and Grace. The sound of breaking glass downstairs snapped her back to reality. They were running out of time. But as she stood, cradling Tommy and preparing to flee, a familiar shape appeared at her bedroom window. Grace, her eyes fierce with determination. Behind her, Sarah could see more shapes moving in the darkness. Grace had led the search team away from the house, only to circle back. She wasn't just protecting them, she was giving them a chance to escape. The next few moments passed in a blur of adrenaline and instinct. Grace guided them through the window onto the garage roof, her movements precise and protective. Sarah clutched Tommy to her chest, her heart pounding as she heard voices below. The search team had entered her bedroom, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness they'd just escaped. The subject was here, a gruff voice announced. There were fresh prints on the windowsill. Grace led them to a sturdy oak tree beside the garage, its branches offering a natural escape route. As they descended, Sarah noticed how Grace positioned herself between them and any potential threat, her eyes constantly scanning the darkness. This wasn't just trained behavior, it was pure devotion. They moved through the shadows of the backyard, Grace leading them toward the dense woods behind the house. But before they could reach the tree line, a spotlight blazed to life, pinning them in its harsh glare. "Stop right there," a voice commanded. "Subject G7 is property of Western Massachusetts Research Center." Sarah squinted against the light, making out the shapes of several men in tactical gear. But what made her blood run cold was the figure stepping out from behind them, a woman in a lab coat, her face set in clinical detachment. "Dr. Mitchell Key," the woman said, addressing Sarah. "I'm Dr. Eleanor Reeves, head of Project Guardian. I believe you have something that belongs to us." Grace stepped forward, placing herself firmly between Sarah and the research team. Her posture was protective but not aggressive, exactly what the project had trained her for, Sarah realized. Even now, she was demonstrating perfect guardian behavior. "She doesn't belong to anyone," Sarah found herself saying, her voice stronger than she felt. "And neither does the truth about what you did." Dr. Reeves's expression hardened. The truth is we created something revolutionary, a perfect protector, a guardian who could care for human children with more dedication than any human caregiver. But we didn't account for the strength of the bonds we were creating." As if to emphasize the point, Grace reached back and gently touched Tommy's foot, her eyes never leaving the threat before them. The gesture was so natural, so loving, that Sarah saw several of the security team members shift uncomfortably. She tracked this child across state lines, Dr. Reeves continued, abandoned everything she knew to watch over him. The project succeeded beyond our wildest expectations, and that's exactly why it had to be terminated. "Because you couldn't control her love," Sarah said, understanding finally dawning. "You could train her to care for children, but you couldn't make her stop caring." A new voice cut through the night, "And that's exactly what we were counting on." David stepped out from the shadows of the trees, accompanied by several people holding cameras and what looked like official badges. Sarah's heart leaped. She recognized them from their photos online. Federal investigators who specialized in research ethics violations. "Dr. Reeves," one of them announced, "your facility has been under investigation for months. We have evidence of numerous ethical violations, including unauthorized human trials involving infants." The security team's weapons lowered as more investigators emerged from the darkness. Dr. Reeves's face had gone pale. "You set this up," she said to David, realization dawning. "You knew she would find them." David moved to stand beside Sarah, his eyes full of regret and determination. "I knew Grace would protect them, just like she protected every baby in that facility. And I knew that when you came for her, you'd reveal everything." The next hour was a whirlwind of activity. Statements were taken, documents were seized, and Dr. Reeves was led away in handcuffs, her protests about valuable research falling on deaf ears. But Sarah hardly noticed any of it. She was focused on Grace, who hadn't left Tommy's side for a moment. As the chaos subsided, David explained everything. He'd been gathering evidence of the facility's ethical violations for months before helping Grace escape. He knew she would seek out Tommy, driven by a bond that transcended the project's clinical parameters. Her nightly visits, her careful attention to Tommy's needs. It had all been documented, proving both the project's success and its fundamental ethical violation. "What happens to Grace now?" Sarah asked, watching as the chimp gently rocked Tommy, who had somehow slept through the entire ordeal. One of the investigators stepped forward. "There's a sanctuary in Florida, specializing in rehabilitated research primates. They've already agreed to take her, with some special provisions." "Provisions?" David smiled. "They're only 2 hours from here, and they've agreed to allow supervised visits." Grace looked up at this, her intelligent eyes bright with understanding. She hadn't just been protecting Tommy, she'd been protecting her right to keep loving him, to keep being part of his life. Months later, Sarah stood in a sunny enclosure in Florida, watching as Grace expertly prepared Tommy's bottle. The sanctuary had built her a special area where she could continue her caregiving activities under safe, ethical conditions. Other chimps were learning from her, showing that her extraordinary capabilities could be used to help her own kind as well. Tommy, now crawling, squealed with delight as Grace handed him his bottle, her movements as gentle and precise as ever. David, who had taken a position as the sanctuary's research oversight officer, watched from nearby, documenting how Grace was helping revolutionize their understanding of primate emotional intelligence. This time, ethically. "You know," Sarah said, watching Grace adjust Tommy's bottle angle with perfect precision, "some might say it's crazy to let a chimpanzee help care for my baby." "Maybe," David replied, "but love isn't always logical. Sometimes the best guardians are the ones who choose us, not the ones we choose." Grace looked up at them and blinked, her eyes full of that same intelligence and devotion that had driven her to find Tommy all those months ago. She had never been just a research subject or even just a caregiver. She was family, a guardian who had chosen her charge and would protect him forever. As the Florida sun set behind them, Sarah watched Grace place a sleeping Tommy in her arms, her movements still as careful as that first night in the kitchen. Some bonds, she realized, transcend species, science, and society's expectations. Some bonds are simply meant to be. 10 years later, the sanctuary's observation deck buzzed with excitement as a group of graduate students gathered for their weekly seminar. Through the large window, they watched in amazement as Grace, now showing touches of grey in her fur, but still moving with precise grace, demonstrated proper bottle sterilization techniques to a young chimp mother. Tommy, now a lanky 12-year-old with his father's thoughtful eyes and his mother's gentle smile, sat cross-legged on the floor of Grace's special enclosure, carefully documenting the session in his research journal. He was the only human allowed inside during these teaching sessions, a privilege earned through years of trust and understanding. "Remember," Sarah's voice carried from the observation deck where she stood addressing the students, "what you're witnessing isn't just instrumental learning. Grace isn't simply mimicking human caregiving behaviors. She's teaching emotional intelligence, something we once thought was uniquely human." As if to demonstrate this point, Grace paused her demonstration to comfort the young chimp mother, who had grown frustrated with the complex sequence of steps. Her gestures were remarkably similar to how she used to soothe Tommy during his own moments of distress years ago. The sanctuary had evolved far beyond its original purpose. What started as a safe haven for Grace had become the world's premier research center for primate emotional intelligence and caregiving behaviors. David's careful documentation of Grace's abilities had revolutionized their understanding of animal consciousness, leading to sweeping reforms in primate research worldwide. But perhaps the most remarkable development was the program that had grown around Grace's unique abilities. The Guardian Project, named in ironic reference to the original research that had brought her into their lives, now helped rehabilitate traumatized primates by pairing them with Grace as a mentor. Her extraordinary capacity for empathy and nurturing had helped dozens of former research chimps recover and develop their own caregiving abilities. Tommy closed his notebook and caught Grace's eye. She immediately recognized his signal. Their session was complete. With careful movements, she helped the young mother chimp return her practice materials to their proper places, then made her way to Tommy's side. "Hey, Grace," he said softly, reaching out to accept the gentle fist bump that had become their special greeting. "Want to see what I wrote today?" Grace settled beside him, her attention focused completely on the notebook as Tommy began to read. Over the years, their bond had evolved into something unique, not quite mother and child, not quite researcher and subject, but a deep connection that defied conventional categories. Sarah watched from above, remembering those terrifying nights 10 years ago when she'd first discovered Grace in her kitchen. How far they'd come from those moments of fear and uncertainty. The sanctuary had become their second home, with Tommy spending every weekend and school holiday here, learning and growing under Grace's watchful eye. David joined them on the observation deck, his research tablet tucked under his arm. The years had been kind to him, the guilt of his past choices eased by the positive changes they'd helped create. "They're publishing the new protocols next month," he announced quietly. "Every primate research facility in the country will be required to implement emotional enrichment programs based on Grace's model." Sarah smiled, watching as Tommy showed Grace his careful drawings of her teaching session. "She changed everything, didn't she? Not just for us, but for all of them." Below, Grace was pointing to something in Tommy's notebook, making a gentle correction to his observations. Her movements were still as precise as ever, but there was an added dimension of wisdom that came from years of teaching others. "Mom," Tommy called up excitedly, "Grace wants to show you something." Sarah made her way down to the enclosure, passing through the security protocols that had become second nature over the years. Grace met her with bright eyes, holding out a piece of paper she'd retrieved from her special cabinet, a space filled with treasures from their shared history. It was the original photograph, the one that had revealed everything that night in Sarah's kitchen. The edges were worn smooth from handling, but the image was still clear, Grace cradling baby Tommy, both of them looking directly at the camera with expressions of perfect contentment. Grace pointed to the photo, then to Tommy and finally to her heart. The same gesture she'd made on that night 10 years ago when she'd entrusted Sarah with the truth. But now it carried a different meaning. Not a desperate plea for understanding, but a celebration of a bond that had transformed them all. "I know, Grace," Sarah said softly, reaching out to squeeze the chimp's weathered hand. "We're family." Later that evening, as the sun set over the sanctuary, Tommy sat with Grace in her favorite spot, a quiet corner where they could watch the other chimps prepare for night. He was working on his college application essay, reading drafts aloud while Grace listened with her characteristic intensity. "Some people have 2 mothers," he read, "and some have none. I have 3. The one who gave birth to me, the one who raises me, and the one who taught me that love knows no boundaries. My guardian Grace." He paused, looking up at the chimp who had shaped his entire life. Grace met his gaze with those same intelligent, loving eyes that had watched over him since before he could remember. In the gathering darkness, Sarah and David stood at a distance, watching their extraordinary family. The nighttime security lights began to flicker on, reminding Sarah of those long-ago nights when a mysterious visitor had changed their lives forever. "You know," David said quietly, "when we started Project Guardian, we thought we were teaching them to be more human, but Grace taught us to be more humane." Sarah nodded, watching as Grace gently corrected Tommy's posture. He had a tendency to slouch while writing, something she'd been trying to fix for years. Some things never changed, and that was exactly how they wanted it. The sanctuary would close soon for the night, but they were in no rush. This was their time, a family bound not by genetics or species, but by something far more powerful, a love that had defied explanation, expectation, and every natural law. A love that had begun with a midnight visitor bringing food to a baby, and had grown into a legacy that would continue changing lives for generations to come. As the stars began to appear overhead, Grace hugged Tommy goodnight, a ritual unchanged since his infancy, and Sarah realized that some questions don't need answers. Sometimes, the miracle isn't in understanding how or why, but in simply accepting the extraordinary gifts that life presents, even when they come in the most unexpected forms. In the end, their story wasn't just about a chimp who learned to care for humans, or humans who learned to accept something remarkable. It was about the endless capacity of the heart to grow, to love and to transform not just ourselves, but the world around us, one gentle gesture at a time. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the world of captivating stories. I trust you found today's narrative as engaging as I did. If you enjoyed this exploration into fascinating and compelling narratives, kindly indicate your appreciation by liking this video. Are you watching on mobile? Show your appreciation with a double tap for hype. For more captivating stories and journeys into the heart of compelling storytelling, please subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so you don't miss a single upload. Your thoughts and interpretations are most welcome. Please share your perspectives on today's story in the comments below. And if you believe others would find this content engaging, please consider sharing the video with your network. Until our next journey into the world of captivating tales, I bid you farewell.